Okay, we're going to start working our way through all the different organ systems of the body. The first one up is going to be the integumentary system, or our skin. And our skin, it turns out, is the largest organ in the body. And integument, if you're wondering or if you're curious at all, is a word that actually means covering. Okay, covering, which is pretty much what our integumentary does. It covers all of our other organs and protects them from the external environment. Now, why do we call the integumentary system an organ system? Well, remember, by definition, when I get two or more cells together and they're coordinating their efforts or functions for a common duty, then we've created a tissue. If I get two or more tissue types together and they are coordinating their efforts to perform some common function, then I have what's called an organ. And of course, if I get two or more organs together that are collaborating to perform a duty for the body, then I have an organ system. So the integument is indeed an organ. It contains actually all four types of tissue. You find epithelial tissue in the integument. You find connective tissue there. You find nervous tissue there. And you find muscle tissue there. So it meets our definition of a organ. And because it contains multiple parts that we're going to talk about in a little bit, it's its own organ system. So we're going to be, over the course of the next few lectures, talking about all kinds of different aspects of skin. We're going to start out by looking at the basic components of the epidermis and the dermis and something called the hypodermis. And then we're also going to take some time to look at some things called epidermal derivatives, things like hair follicles and fingernails and sweat glands, things like that. So let's talk first about what the different regions of the skin are. There are two main regions of the skin, and they include the epidermis, and that is the layer that is actually composed of epithelial tissue exclusively, and all of the properties of epithelial tissue we learned about previously apply here. It's highly cellular, meaning lots of cells packed very tightly together. It's avascular. There's no room for blood vessels to be present, et cetera, et cetera. It opens to a lumen. All of those events that we talked about before apply to, or all of those characteristics apply to the epidermis. Now, immediately deep to the epidermis is another thicker layer called the dermis. And we'll talk more about what the dermis is made up of later, but for now, just think of it as being primarily made of connective tissue, with lots of different types of epidermal derivative organs found in it, and all kinds of different cells that we'll learn about in a while. Now, there's also deep to the dermis a third layer of tissue that some people think is part of the skin, but it technically is not. It is not classified as part of the skin, but we do usually talk about it when we talk about the skin because it's immediately adjacent to it. And that layer is called the hypodermis, and it is composed primarily of adipocytes, which are mature fat cells. So let's go ahead here, and before we launch into talking about the epidermis, I want to just give you a very brief overview about the functions of the epidermis. What's the skin all about? What's it do for us? What are the epidermis and dermis together do for us? So the skin has a number of important roles it plays, and one that people sometimes don't really think about, but it is a role of the skin, is its role in communication. We have lots of sensory receptors in our skin. We have some, and we'll learn about this later when we get to the nervous system. We have sensory receptors that are sensitive to changes in temperature. We have others in the skin that are sensitive to mechanical pressure. We have others in the skin that are sensitive to pain. And all of those different receptors serve to help communicate information from the external environment to our brain so that we can then integrate that information, and then if we decide we need to do something about it, to send an outgoing signal to somewhere in the body to respond. The skin, another thing it does that a lot of people don't often think about, is it's a site of waste removal. Okay, this is where we can actually excrete waste products. And most of us think of the kidneys as being the primary place where we excrete waste products from the blood plasma, but when you sweat, there are a certain number of electrolytes and other metabolic waste products that are found in that sweat. So this is a way we can get rid of waste. Interestingly enough, people who are on kidney dialysis, whose kidneys are very poorly off, that are very close to shutting down, frequently you will notice that they have a particular smell to them, and that's because the skin is partially compensating for the kidneys by excreting waste products on the surface of the skin. The most obvious thing that the skin does, the one that most everybody always associates with the skin, is this idea that it's there to protect us, right? We have this coating on the outside of the body. It helps prevent water loss. Very important for preventing water loss. It serves as a barrier so that we don't get bacteria that shouldn't be there growing on the body. It serves other roles too in terms of protection, but those are a couple big ones. Now, one point I want to make here about protection relates to antimicrobial soaps, like the picture here you see of soft soap. And what I want to tell you about this is that if you use antimicrobial soaps, you should stop. Please stop. Because there is a chemical in antimicrobial soaps called triclosan. And triclosan, it turns out, is a great antimicrobial chemical. It's great at killing bacteria. The problem is, not only does it kill bacteria, it also breaks down something on the surface of our skin called the acid mantle. And the acid mantle is basically just, it's kind of like a layer on the skin that is composed of chemicals that create a relatively acidic environment on the surface of the skin. And it turns out that many bacteria do not do well in an acidic environment. And so this is sort of it's a protective mechanism. By having a low pH to our skin, we're more apt or more likely to discourage bacterial growth on the surface of the skin. Antimicrobial soaps break down that acid mantle. So while you might, when you use antimicrobial soap, maybe you do kill a few bacteria, you also remove the acid mantle, and the end result is now your skin is even more susceptible to bacterial invasion than it was before you used the soap. If you don't believe me that antimicrobial soaps really don't do the job, let me give you an example of a study that was performed in Chicago a few years ago. The Centers for Disease Control, the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, decided to do a study in Chicago, and they took 300 families in the Chicago area. They randomly divided them into two groups. In both groups, they taught them how to properly wash their hands, and then they sent each group away, 150 families in one group, 150 families in the other group, and for 1 year they asked each group to use a particular hand washing product. For the control group, they were asked to just use regular old bars of hand soap. Typical, same old thing that's found in every household. For the other 150 people, they had them, this was the treatment group. The treatment group were asked to use antibacterial soap, such as soft soap. At the end of 1 year, they had all of the families come back in, and they took samples or swabs off of every family member's hands and cultured them to see what the bacterial content was for those hands. And what they found after the conclusion of 1 year is it didn't matter whether you used hand soap or antibacterial soap. There was no significant difference in terms of number of bacteria present on the surface of the skin. And so you might think, well, gee, if there was no difference, then there's no harm in me using an antibacterial soap. Not true. Triclosan is an antibacterial agent. The more we expose bacteria to triclosan, the more we increase the likelihood that some of those bacteria will develop resistance to that triclosan. And as soon as a bacteria become resistant to the triclosan, it no longer works at all. So the best thing that you can do for yourself, for your family, is to use regular old hand soap and leave triclosan and other types of antibacterial soaps to places like hospital and healthcare facilities where infection is a much more critical or dangerous thing to have occur. Okay. What are some other things that the skin does for us besides communication, waste removal, or waste secretion, protection? Well, we've talked about another thing that the skin does, and that is body temperature. We mentioned that during the first week of class when we were learning about homeostasis and negative feedback loops. And I told you before that if your body becomes too hot, that it will, through a series of signals and interplays between neurons in the brain and different effector organs in the body, will result in systemic-wide vasodilation near the surface of the skin to release heat from the surface of the skin. And we will also engage in sweating, which is another activity that the skin is directly responsible for via these things called sweat glands that we'll learn about later. On the other hand, if your body is too cold, then your blood vessels will undergo vasoconstriction to prevent heat loss from the surface of the skin. Something else often occurs when we're cold, other than shivering, and that is the production of goosebumps. Some people call them goose pimples, right? Those little bumps on the surface of our skin, and they're associated with individual hairs on the surface of our skin. It turns out right at the base of every hair in our body is a tiny little muscle made of smooth muscle tissue, and it's called an erector pili muscle. In this diagram here from your book, they call it a piloerector muscle. It's the same thing, erector pili muscle or piloerector muscle, either way. And this involuntarily, in other words, it doesn't require a conscious thought on your part, it contracts when temperatures drop and the body's cold. Now, if we were, say, a dog, that would be a very useful way of trapping air molecules near the surface of the skin so that we could then warm them and use that as sort of an insulative effect. We in humans, this is kind of a leftover from evolution. We don't have enough hair on the surface of our skin to really effectively trap any air, but we still get the whole goose pimples look whenever we do get cold or when we get scared. Last thing I want to talk about very quickly is the purpose of the hypodermis, and this is really the only point in time when we're going to talk much about the hypodermis because, again, it's not technically part of the integumentary system, but because of its immediate spatial relationship with the epidermis and the dermis, we talk about it now as opposed to some other time during the semester. So what are some of the things that the hypodermis does for us? Well, one thing it does is places where we have fat tissue associated, for example, deep to the integument, we have a greater range of movement. We have ability to allow the skin to move more freely without ripping or tearing. It also serves as a great shock absorber. We have, for example, fat that surrounds many of our internal organs, and that helps to protect them to a degree. It also serves an insulative aspect for our body in that it does help to retain heat when it's cold. And I guess that's a good thing. And then, of course, because it has such a high percentage of adipocytes in it, it is very good at storage, right? And in this case, it's storage of lipids for later mobilization as an energy source. Now, the distribution of fat on males and females differs. For males, it's primarily housed in the abdominal region and on the sides of the thighs and the buttocks. In females, it's primarily associated in the abdominal region, the sides and the thighs and the buttocks, but also under the arms and to a lesser degree on the back of the neck. We do not have hypodermis everywhere in the body. It turns out that there are a few places that are void of hypodermis, and one of the most obvious places this is your shins. If you feel the top of your shins or the front of your shins, you'll notice that there is not much cushioning there at all, and that's because really all you have is the integument and a little bit of muscle tissue, and then you're right to bone immediately. Okay, next up we're going to talk about the different layers of the epidermis.